It's always great to return to Stanford. It makes me wonder why I ever left. Seems like a paradise over here. I'll briefly introduce my project, the Taraxo Protocol, which is meant to facilitate IoT data transactions. So this is a slide that I put together to really demonstrate sort of the impetus for developing this. So what is it? What problems are we trying to solve in IoT that requires a solution like blockchain, right? So the idea behind it is that the vast majority of IoT investments, right, even as recent as 2015, have been investments into hardware and infrastructure, right? So the actual sensors and the sort of the storage and connectivity, things like that, right? While when you look at the actual application layer, which is the sort of green part of it, right, where the data and analytics and actually people creating value out of the data that's collected by IoT devices, that is a very, very small portion of the entire investment. And then based on a lot of the projections from consulting firms and industry groups, 5 years later, even by 2020, once again, the vast majority of growth is still going to be occurring inside infrastructural investments, right? So the problem really with this picture, the key problem with this picture is that unless this green part becomes the majority or a huge portion of the overall investment, we're not going to see an explosive growth or adoption of IoT technologies, right? Because the whole point of IoT is that, or the whole point of any technology is that you get to see a return on your investment. If you cannot develop viable applications, analytics that actually drive growth, that actually drive revenues and drive profitability, you're just never ever going to get widespread adoption, right? So what are some of the key obstacles I think people think about when they think about, so why aren't people adopting IoT, or why aren't people sharing data more widely with IoT, right? So the key problem, like I said before, is that you can't really get the value out of IoT devices until you start sharing and trading that data on a very, very wide basis, right? So a lot of people need to have access to that data in order to develop viable applications. So I think a good example that I keep giving people is sort of, what is the most successful IoT device, sort of in recent memory, right? It's actually the smartphone, the iPhone. That is the most successful IoT device. And when Apple created iPhone, they made a very interesting design choice or a business decision, is that they said that we're going to open up this IoT device hardware functionalities as well as its data in the form of the App Store, so that everybody around the world can develop applications on top of it, right? So there's a critical realization that by sharing the data, by sharing the functionalities of IoT devices, you can actually create more value, not less. But this is not the way that most people think, right? This is not the way that most people who have IoT devices or have IoT data or could have IoT devices and data think about it, right? So what are some of the constraints and obstacles that sort of bar people from sharing their IoT data, right? So first of all, there's a lot of concerns around data security, network constraints, a lot of things that sort of deal with the fact that, am I really the owner of this data? Is my data going to be exposed to the wider world? Are my competitors going to gain visibility into my business operations, right? So with blockchain, you have a cryptographically secure network, right, where devices are not very easily compromised, where the data are cryptographically secured, and ownership is guaranteed through signatures, right? So that, I think, goes a long way to address the problem with, with data security as well as privacy concerns, right? You also go into the problem of people thinking about costs, right? Lack of use cases and high costs. So a lot of the costs that go into IoT is not just the cost of the hardware, but also the cost of storage, the cost of analytics, right? So a lot of these costs are sort of built in, a lot of them are fixed. It's very, very difficult to get out of long-term contracts with a lot of vendors. So what's really good about blockchain is that it's very good at fractionalizing resources. It's not only is it very good at fractionalizing resources, it's also very good at making use of underutilized resources, right? So if you are on a blockchain system, you can basically rent storage or rent processing power, mostly in the form of smart contracts and also in a lot of other sort of blockchain projects such as Golem. You are actually able to basically pay for exactly the tiny amount of storage and processing power and resources that you use, right? There's no long-term contracts you sign. There's really nothing that prevents you from using or paying for exactly what you need, right? There's always the risk of people thinking that they might become overly dependent upon an individual vendor or third party when they start sharing the data and start outsourcing the data analytics to third parties, right? Well, we have a decentralized ecosystem with blockchain technology, so that you're never really dealing with a single entity, right? You're dealing with a very, very wide network of different people. So at any given time, you don't really have to be worried about that you're becoming dependent on a third party, right? And then I think probably the most problematic problem and obstacle in IoT is the idea that you don't have viable business cases, right? How do I make money off of this IoT device? How do I make money off the data that I create? Now, one of the things I say is that, well, blockchain is not going to magically invent business models for you. That's nothing in the world magically invents business models for you. But I think what blockchain is very, very good at is that it's very, very good at sourcing a lot of open innovation from the open source community, right? It's very, very good at getting people to collaborate on a specific task in a very distributed manner, right? So one of the things that, and just using the iPhone example, is that if you don't open things up, if you don't start sharing things, if you don't start trading things, then you will never be able to figure out the maximum value of the assets that you have in the form of IoT data, right? So it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. It creates a vicious cycle. It's that the more you sort of hoard your data, the more you hoard your devices, the less uses that you yourself are going to think of. Because as an individual company, you're not going to have the most brilliant people all concentrated within your company to figure out every single possible use case, right? So that's sort of a vicious cycle. And I think blockchain, by breaking down a lot of the barriers to actually sharing the data, can actually help propel people to share more of the data, and in that sense, help create more business cases and use cases. So on a sort of a low level, I think blockchain is very interesting in that it enables devices to become it becomes a very different entity, right? So the way that I think about sort of the interplay between AI and blockchain as related to a specific IoT device is that AI helps the device to understand what it needs to do, right? The device knows what it needs to do next. Blockchain enables the device to do the things that it needs to do. So blockchain gives devices unique identities in the form of a private public key. With those keys, because it can start signing things, it gives the device this concept of ownership, right? Devices can now own things, right? Right now, we own devices. Devices don't own anything else, right? Now they can own things, right? And also the third thing is that because they can own things, they can also start transacting with other devices or other entities on the network. Those other entities could be software, hardware, they could be people, they could be other devices, whatever, right?
Stephen, can you stop for a second? And that's an interesting concept. What do you mean by the device can own something? Can you give us a specific example?
Yeah, so if you're, for example, right, say you're a weather sensor, right, in the middle of a weather station, right? So normally what will happen is that, I probably, I bought the weather sensor, or some weather station owns that weather sensor. So they, they upload the data to their central server, and then they sit there and figure out, well, what am I going to do with this data, right? So that's sort of how things work right now. But in the future, if devices become sufficiently intelligent and the network becomes sufficiently mature, that device sitting there has its own ideas about what it can do with that data. Right? For example, it can say that, hey, actually, I know that there are data markets out there that I can actually sell my data at. So I'm going to hook myself onto that data market and say, here's the data I have. I'm going to be able to sell it. And maybe also at the same time, I know that, hey, there are algorithms out there that could actually improve the sensitivity or the analytics which I can use to process data. And I can just buy sort of that algorithm, or actually borrow the processing power of that algorithm, or rent it. So it's actually able to make independent decisions without human intervention, right? Like I said, AI makes the device know what it needs to do. Blockchain allows the device to do the things that it needs to do.
So it's really intelligent end-to-end communication.
Yeah, exactly, right? Okay, so we're talking a lot of very abstract concepts, right? Let's talk about applications, right? And this is sort of a lot of it is sort of the bane of IoT, is that successful business models are incredibly rare to find. So several here to give you, I'll talk about the first few examples. The first one is the idea of cars. So cars have a lot of data that is generating. So we're currently working with this company called CarBlock. And what CarBlock does is that they actually have over 1 million vehicles in North America installed with their smart devices that are uploading a ton of data about the car's telemetry. Who's going to buy that data? Well, insurance companies want to buy that data to better assess the risk of driver behavior based on driver behavior. Car repair chains want to buy that data to be able to acquire customers early, and also to better optimize their supply chain in terms of parts and technician allocations for their different branches. So you get less sort of rejection rate, when the customers walk in. So this is an area where we have a large data set, right? So cars generate a lot of data, right? So in the traditional model, if a small subset of that data is useful for some reason, then what a company would do is that they would just take that small data set out and sell it to the person who wants it, and that's it. That would be sort of the end of how these things work. Now, what we actually want to do, and actually what CarBlock wants to do is, hey, why don't we leverage the 1 or 2 viable business models, right, that actually make it so it's worth it, the consumers actually purchase these devices, worth it for the manufacturers to make these devices, the entire value chain just works out. Why don't we leverage those small business models that are relevant to a subset of the overall data set, and we just use that to get the entire data set, expose the entire data set for trading, right? So that's what this is all about, is that we really try to democratize all the data that has been formerly locked into sort of databases and devices that had not been sort of seeing the light of day, right? So who knows what that data could be used for? So that's really the beauty of a lot of these applications. The second one we talk about is crop intelligence. So one of the largest clients that I've worked with when I was previously a strategy consultant with this company called Syngenta. So we actually helped them set their global digital strategy as well as their China strategy. And one of the things that we sort of learned while we're working with them is that at least in the Chinese market, people have increasingly started using drones to deploy crop protection products. So they use drones to spray pesticides because the rising sort of awareness of safety as well as the rising costs of human labor, drone delivery actually starts to make a lot of sense. So there are all these drone operators all across China with fleets of drones that would just move from region to region, right, during spraying seasons to spray pesticides on the crops. These drones could be collecting a lot of data. They could be collecting tons of data. For example, if you just put a camera on those drones, they can take the photos of the crops that they're spraying over. With those photos, what you can tell is you can tell the type of crop, you can tell the crop growth stage, you can tell what type of pests are in the crop, insects, weeds, fungi, and bacterial infections. Okay, so that data set is non-existent right now. Nobody has that data set because it's never been collected. But here we have hundreds of thousands of drones flying around not collecting that data, which they very well could be, right? So, well, who needs that data? Who's willing to pay for that data? Well, agri-science companies like Syngenta, like Bayer, Monsanto, Dow, DuPont, they would love to pay for that data, right? So it gives them market intelligence, who's planting what where. It gives them understanding of diseases, how it's spreading, so they can model disease spreading behavior, so they can better allocate their sales and marketing spend, as well as coordinate their supply chain management, right? Farmers would definitely love to have this data, right? For example, if I'm a watermelon farmer, and I want to know, hey, should I be planting watermelons in the next season? This is something I never realized until I got into agriculture, was that it's a huge gamble. Agriculture is a huge gamble. Every season, you're gambling on what you should be planting, right? So what usually happens in China, and I'm sure it probably happens in a lot of developing countries, is that no one knows what to plant. So they'll say, well, Mr. Wang last year, he made a ton of money doing watermelons. So we're all going to do watermelons this year, right? So you get oversupply, and watermelons rotting in the field, and a watermelon's horrible. No one's going to plant watermelons. Let's plant tomatoes next year. Everyone plant tomato next year, and everyone gets screwed, right? So it's sort of this mentality that really causes this boom and bust sort of cycle in agriculture, and it's very, very, very risky for the farmers, right? It's actually very bad for everybody involved, because the farmers lose a lot of money, the government has to come in and clean it up, or has a riot on its hands, all kinds of bad things. So the farmers would love to know who's planting what, right? If they know that the 10 surrounding villages are all planting one thing, maybe I shouldn't be planting that, right? Maybe I should plant something else. They would love to know about pests, right? So if there's a sort of locusts are coming my way, 100 kilometers away, I should be stocking up on pesticides, right? To prevent the fact that there are locusts coming. So that data set is also non-existent, and farmers will love to have that data, and I'm sure they're not going to pay for it because these crop protection companies are just going to buy that data and give it to the farmers as value-added services to promote their own products, right? So this is another instance where we see that there could be very, very viable business models for data that goes uncollected, right? And that data could also be shared, on a data market, for IoT data market, right? Okay, so before I talk about this, I guess I'll talk about sort of why is it that we felt was necessary to create a new protocol, right? So why reinvent the wheel, right? Why can't we just use what's out there today, right? So this is back in sort of 2017 when we're starting to investigate, why, how could we use blockchain, given that it has so many complementary properties with IoT that it could be used to really advance the field. Could we actually use some of the existing technologies that we see, right? So if you looked at some of the general purpose platforms such as Ethereum, we all know that Ethereum has a lot of sort of throughput and scalability issues, right? Single CryptoKitty app can clog up the entire network. So that wasn't really viable. That we think if you start hooking up billions of IoT devices to this platform, it's gonna choke like there's no tomorrow, right? So that's really not gonna work out. Then we look at other technologies, something like IOTA, right, which is purportedly sort of designed specifically for IoT devices. And we found out that sort of IOTA's consensus algorithm has some pretty fundamental flaws with it. It's very easily spammed. Actually, the random walk way that it actually validates these transactions create huge problems. Like, so your transaction could be verified in seconds or weeks, depends on how lucky you are, right? And also, if you're unlucky and your transaction accidentally landed on a double spend, well, 2 weeks later, your transaction that you thought was, sort of validated, it could be overturned, right? Because, the sort of consensus algorithm does not have a full view of the entire network. I'm sure they're working hard to fix it. Just not really sure when that's actually going to happen. So at the time when we started looking at a lot of the existing solutions, we found out that, hey, actually, nothing really fit what we actually needed, okay? So I'm not going to talk about the first one because it's probably less relevant, but I'm going to talk about the next three. So when you're talking about IoT devices, you're always talking about a device that has very limited computational and storage capabilities. So we all know that to run a full node on a network like Bitcoin or Ethereum, it requires a ton of computation power and a ton of storage space. Like, not even close, right? Your laptop can't even do it. And if you're talking about your phone or even like an IoT gateway, just forget about it. That's not going to work. So normally what will happen is that conventional sort of light node implementations basically said that, hey, you're just going to have to trust a full node blindly because you can't do anything, right? So we found that, okay, so maybe for certain use cases that's interesting, but if we actually really want to enable device autonomy, that it can actually become an independent entity and participant on a network, it has to be pretty trustless. It doesn't really need to trust anybody else. So one of the things that we actually set out to do is create a set of designs to enable light nodes so that IoT devices and IoT gateways can actually be able to tell over the network by itself what's true and what's not using the exact same consensus algorithm that the rest of the network uses. Okay. The next one is what we call concurrent smart contract system, right? So we talk about IoT devices, we talk about devices trading. Most of the time when they're trading, they're not trading coins, right? It's not like devices are, I'm going to give you a coin, you give me a coin. Most of the time they're trading information, they're trading data, right? So that's most of the time what they're doing. And data trading fundamentally requires smart contracts. If nothing else, just to make sure there's no counterparty risk, right? So once again, smart contract is going to be the primary bottleneck for existing blockchain systems, right? So what we actually develop is that we have developed a concurrent smart contract system that enables two things. So on the single individual node, a node is able to process hundreds of contract calls simultaneously in parallel, right? Unlike, for example, on Ethereum, they do it, in sequence, right? And then across the network, right? Across the network, what we're doing is that we're making sure that the first time anybody processes any given contract call, there's only one node that's processing it. That means there's no wasted work, right? So on something like Ethereum, if you have 10,000 miners, 9,999 of them just wasted their work every single round, right? Because only one block wins out, right? So on this, on our network, that doesn't happen, right? Everybody's work is valuable. No one's work is wasted, and order is well defined. Right? And the third thing that we are doing is what's called the encrypted data market. So I think this is going to be the first DApp that we actually create on top of the Taraxa protocol, because we think that it's going to be a very, very interesting and primary use case of the Taraxa protocol is to allow devices to sell their data to other entities who want to purchase the data, right? So it's a combination of encryption algorithms. They're all mature algorithms that allow the devices to encrypt the data that they upload into anywhere since it's encrypted. It allows encrypted search, enables transactions of historical data. It also enables subscriptions to data streams, right? So everything's encrypted. So I think this is what, this gives the device that created the data perfect control over who gets to see that data. And it makes it agnostic on where it actually stores the data, right? And this is another sort of very key, I think, application for adoption in terms of IoT data trading. Okay. I won't go into a lot of details with the technology. Let's see. Yeah, so a lot of people actually talk about, this is actually an interesting topic, is that a lot of people actually ask sort of how do you make money, right? So how does Taraxa make money, right? What's your business model? And what's very interesting is that in sort of blockchain ecosystems, the team that actually creates a protocol has no business model, right? So we don't charge money. We don't have any revenue. We're not really allowed to have any sales. So we can't charge anyone any money. So our job as the founding team of Taraxa is to drive the adoption of the protocol, right? And what's in it for me, right? What's in it for us? Because we hold a certain amount of tokens that are held by the team. So we are heavily incented to make sure that there's wide adoption of our protocol so that our tokens rise in value. So this is basically, you can think of it as sort of the ecosystem is a country, and sort of the tokens are sort of its currency, and I want to increase GDP of this country in order to increase the value for my currency, right? So I'm not really here to charge people money. I'm here to get people to use it as much as possible. The more they use it, the more valuable my holdings are, right? So this actually makes it very, very easy for us to work with people, because when people hear that you're here to do free work with me, they're very happy, right? They're very happy that I do free work. That's great, right? So we're able to work with a large number of different players across the entire value chain, and we're really here to develop ecosystem players that they themselves can develop very viable and traditional business models on top of our protocol, right? So one of the things that we're heavily looking at are players who are interested in creating data markets, right? So like for example, the Carblock is an example. There's another company that we are opening sort of negotiations with. Is actually in agriculture. It's an apple company. They grow apples and they process apples and they sell apples, right? So they're based in Western China, and they're also very interested in leveraging blockchain technology to really start sharing and trading agricultural data, so that they can start to create standardized solutions, standardized planting solutions, right, for agriculture. That's a whole other interesting topic that we can talk about later if you're interested. It allows the securitization of farmland income. So we're looking for companies specifically with the resources, the expertise, and the vision to create these sort of decentralized data markets, so that they can help to start democratizing that data, and they themselves become sort of a portal, right, where other people find data within a specific vertical, right? So just like Carblock. I mean, in a lot of cases, right, a lot of these companies, what they can do is that they can actually go with the traditional business model, right, which they can say, I'm going to hoard all this data, and I'm going to play the information asymmetry game, and I'm just going to make tons of money off of other people's data, right? I mean, that's what almost every single internet company does today, right? So it actually does take a certain amount of vision and guts to actually say that I'm going to throw away this tried and true business model that gives me very high valuations, because I believe that this decentralized future is coming, and rather than being disrupted by others, I'm just going to proactively disrupt myself before someone else disrupts me, right? So it's actually pretty interesting. Yeah, so this is sort of a more in-depth example of how the card block ecosystem will work. So you have the hardware maker, the device makers, and that they make these smart devices that go into cars that that then the car owners actually purchase and install and run on their card block app. And in the card block, they run a data market, which then sells data to people like insurance companies and car repair shops. And Taraxa in the back end, they will provide services to embed the protocol onto their hardware. They can provide free technical support to create apps for card block. It can also help card block build these data markets and actually drive volume onto their data market. Okay. So all these services are free. Right?
So if they're free, you do have to pay your costs somehow.
Yes, that's why we need to raise money. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, but this is generally people raise money up front because they'll have revenue later.
Yeah, so this is very interesting. So once again, I actually gave a talk at METI. I think it's the Ministry of Economic and Trade and Industry in Japan. Yeah. So they asked me this question as well. In which case I said that, look, I think. I wrote this whole other article about my vision for a decentralized future. So my philosophy is that large companies in general, first of all, companies are getting larger and larger, right? Because we need to, sort of increasingly coordinate more. As technology becomes more and more complex, having a viable business requires a larger amounts of coordination of resources, right? So for example, before the Industrial Revolution, like you have a 20-person company, like, oh, that's a huge company, 20 people, right? So you have the Industrial Revolution, you have the Information Revolution, you have all these technological advances that actually mandate that you start coordinating a lot of resources, and that creates huge companies. And along with huge companies, you have multi-layer management. You run into like 10, 12 layers of management. You have huge bureaucracy set on the side to coordinate the sort of the information flow and the resource flow, right? And people make poor decisions, right? Because every single company is a planned economy. It's actually a very interesting thing is that we're all taught that market economies are very efficient, but every single company is a planned economy. And increasingly, we're living in a world where we're dominated by huge multinational corporations who are planned economies. And when they deal with each other, they deal with each other to create planned economies, right? So this is a trend that has not really been reversed. Since time immemorial, right? Companies get bigger and bigger. Organizations become bigger and bigger. They become very inefficient. They stamp out innovation, and they are disrupted by smaller companies, right? I actually spent a good part of my consulting career teaching large companies how to behave more like small startups, right? It's not easy, right? It's not easy. So the idea is that how blockchain is actually an interesting way for you to actually start to delayer these organizations and actually start breaking down large corporations and economic entities into smaller entities, right? Now, in order to create these type of ecosystems, right, companies and markets and ecosystems don't just spring out of nowhere from day one. So the idea of this type of like for example like Taraxa, right, as a project team or as a company or whatever you want to call it. It's an interesting setup because it's an organization that's set up in the beginning to be highly centralized to drive adoption and to improve the ecosystem. But as time goes on, the more successful they become, the more unnecessary they make themselves. And in fact, as time goes on, they're actually not really able to incur any kind of change within the ecosystem because as more and more people adopt the protocol and adopt the ecosystem, their voice becomes diminished over time. And then after a while, they just become obsolete, right? So it's very, very interesting. It's sort of like, you start with a monarchy that's guaranteed to evolve into a democracy by design, right? Because you're not gonna be able to hold on to that power over time. So this is why, if you raise however much money you raise, the team doesn't need revenue because the team should disappear after 5 to 10 years. If we do your job right, the team should just disappear. And it shouldn't exist because if it exists forever, that's like, it's a monarchy forever, right? It's like Lenin said the transitional government, right? We're gonna have the dictatorship, the proletariat that never goes away. Well, this goes away by design, right? So it's very interesting. That was a very long-winded answer to your question.
No, it's a fascinating thing because this is kind of anti the classic startup mentality, right?
Yeah.
We're going to start our company, we're going to grow it. Eventually, we will exit in one big, exchange that's either being bought by some bigger company or going public and becoming
a huge company.
A planned economy. Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
a huge economy. I think Peter Thiel said that there's no reason to create a startup unless you expect it to become a monopoly, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, this is another thing that I sort of talk about, which is that, in business, being a strategy consultant, we always talk about competitive advantages. How do you build up competitive advantages so that others cannot enter into your market, right?
But still, this can't be the pitch that you give to investors, right?
They don't really ask that many questions at this point, I guess.
Oh, I see.
I tell anyone who's willing to listen that this is the pitch. This is what I tell them, right? So, and we also talk about sort of in business. We also talk about sustainable competitive advantages, which are very rare, but if you're able to achieve it, then that creates a natural monopoly, right? And you just have something that builds on top of each other over time that you become so powerful that you start to corner the market. Right, so that is very, very, very good for the shareholders at a company, right? And it's very natural for that company as an economic entity to maximize its own profits and maximize any advantages it's able to build, right? But it's not really great for society as a whole because it's inefficient, right? So large companies, as they gain more power, as they gain more advantages, they start to behave, I would say, very poorly in terms that they behave very inefficiently. They start playing games with information asymmetry. They start having rent-seeking behaviors, right? So you have all sorts of bad behaviors which large corporations that have truly sustainable competitive advantages that are actually very bad for society as a whole, right? So what you really want to do, and this is not really possible, but might not be perfectly possible, but my idea is that you want to introduce as much perfect competition as you can and remove sources of competitive advantage and make everything an equal playing field, right? So my sort of perfect future is that every single industry work like, sort of high frequency trading, right? Where any sort of advantage can appear and quickly disappear in microseconds. As soon as you develop a viable trading strategy, you start trading the market, and then, other algorithms start catching up and, kill your arbitrage opportunity. And there is no economic opportunity cost, right? So that's sort of a more idealized future.
Okay, here's Taraxa down at the bottom level, right? At the sort of platform level for this. Is the data that you're dealing with really essentially, does it divide itself up into tokens? Are we talking about something where individuals could have an ICO and all buy a bunch of tokens that are part of Taraxa?
So tokens are, people keep questioning, so why do you need a token, right? Why is that necessary? So I think from a functional perspective, tokens are used to fuel the operations in the network. So for example, if someone performs an action for you, like process a smart contract, then you need to get paid, and they get paid in this token.
So that's more up at the level of the car block then, because I know they talk about tokens.
Yeah, there are a couple types of tokens, right?
Yeah.
So there are a couple types of tokens.
Yeah.
So you maybe want to talk about the difference between coins and tokens, right?
Yeah.
So coins are usually the native currency that's generated on the blockchain, right? Tokens, as people usually talk to them, and 99% of all ICOs are such forms of tokens, is that they're smart contracts actually created on top of an existing platform. For most of the time, it's Ethereum. So they by themselves don't have a lot of functionality other than the fact that they're a representation of value. For the ecosystem, which I think is actually trumps sort of the utility functionality.
But in a sense, you've got a piece of data. Mm-hmm. If you're dividing up data to take this data from some weather station or from crop information or whatever, are people really buying the pieces of data?
Yeah, people are purchasing data. Yeah, people are purchasing data with the tokens, right?
Yeah, right. Okay, so does that mean that your company would kind of be at a level to enable those kind of token purchases? Is that higher level in the stack?
Okay, so the tokens, the coins for Taraxa they're pre-minted and they're distributed according to a certain distribution schedule, right? Some of it goes to investors, some of it goes to free giveaways.
And those are investment items.
Yeah, but those things are used on the the platform and the ecosystem.
Okay.
They're used on the ecosystem.
Right.
Yeah, they're used on the ecosystem as a form of payment, and they're also a representation of value for the ecosystem.
Okay.
So a lot of people will ask, well, why do you need a separate token or why do you need a separate coin? I mean, there are obvious technological reasons in that if you create something like this, a completely new protocol, they're not going to be compatible with any other existing tokens anyway. You could create atomic swap protocols to swap it with other tokens, that's fine. But at the end of the day, because your ledger is fundamentally different than the other ledgers, you need your own token. But I think more importantly to realize that that specific token or the coin is a representation of value for the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. So you can think of it, it's sort of like, I mean, it is the currency, right? It is the currency. It's like the US dollar, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's probably not a whole lot of point to talk about this, but there are a lot of IoT projects out there. I'm probably missing a lot too. I recently found out there are a lot more.
Are all of those using blockchain?
Yes, all of them are using blockchain in one form or another. Yeah.
Okay. And Taraxa is distinctive in what way?
So Taraxa is distinctive in the fact that, well, in the mostly I think in the light node implementations, right? Because I think we're probably the only project that I know of that actually puts a lot of time into designing light nodes to allow devices to become trusted participants on the network. And we also are the only we're the only project that has concurrent smart contracts.
Okay.
Encrypted data markets, I think there are certain people that might be creating it. I think there's a project in the Bay Area called NewCipher that's actually creating these encrypted data markets. So there are a few players in that field as well. Okay. So I think that's probably a good introduction.
Okay, this is a good start. We've got there a lot of things that I want to ask you about and talk to you about. First of all, I want to ask, did being in China have anything to do with you coming up with the idea for this kind of a blockchain protocol company? Yeah,
because I think, that's an interesting question. So now I don't know if I could have come up with it had I not been in China, but I can sort of talk about how I came up with this IoT plus blockchain idea, right? So my first startup in China was a hardware startup that makes mesh networks. That was back in 2009, 2010, which is, I think, in retrospect, might have been way too early for IoT. But it was interesting because it got me to sort of pretty deep into the IoT field and start understanding sort of the limitations and advantages of IoT devices, both from a technology perspective as well as from a commercial perspective. In terms of blockchain, I think I was very interesting because China has always sort of been pretty early in the cryptocurrency field, right? I think for the longest time it was the largest sort of mining base of operation for Bitcoin until the government sort of banned it and everyone started moving out. It's probably the largest trading volume in the world, and I think Bobby's BTCC was for probably half a year or 9 months the largest exchange in the world. For Bitcoin, so it's pretty impressive. And it was also a region where I think for a long time the vast majority of investments into blockchain projects came from. Actually, if you talk to a lot of the early projects here even anywhere in the world, right, in Silicon Valley or whatever, they're all very cognizant about who gave them their money, right? It's the Chinese people gave them their money. So I think China has been a very interesting hotbed for cryptocurrency, I first got introduced to Bitcoin I think in 2013 when Bobby told me about Bitcoin, this thing called Bitcoin. Unfortunately, I didn't buy any, or I bought very little. That was unfortunate because back then it was very, very cheap. I think it was like 200 USD per coin, so could have made a lot of money. And I think after he told me about it and the Central Bank of China declared that it's not a currency and banned all financial institutions from working with crypto exchanges. So you start seeing actually this steady decline starting beginning of 2014 when Bitcoin prices just start dropping like crazy. It dropped for the rest of the year into 2015. So that sort of like diminished my sort of interest in Bitcoin. And then towards the end of 2015, another Stanford alum, Alex Liu, who's the founder of MyCoin in Taiwan, and he told me, hey, there's this thing called blockchain, right? It's actually the technology that's powering Bitcoin. So you should sort of look into it. So I went to a hackathon in Shanghai that was actually founded by or coordinated by Deloitte and this other company called Wanxiang, which is a huge conglomerate. It's actually the largest private enterprise in China and the earliest institutional investor into blockchain in the world, right? So it's very interesting. And at that meeting, I met I guess today there would be considered luminaries in the field. I met Vitalik at the time. He was just a Russian kid named Vitalik, right? So met a lot of people there who actually went on to build extremely successful companies with blockchain technology. So at that time, I think it was sort of spent a lot of time thinking about it, and blockchain at the time, I think the vast majority of applications people were talking about were private chains and consortium chains, right? So you build a consortium chain between banking and insurance and all these financial institutions, right? So very interesting, not that exciting, right? So it seems like blockchain was just another piece of like ERP software of some kind that you do, and if you get into it, you become an IT consultant, great, that's doesn't seem that disruptive or world changing, right? And so in 2017, I had another chance to actually look at IoT. IoT devices, because Chris Dye, you probably know Chris Dye, another classmate of mine, we were looking at sort of investment projects between Japan and China, and one of the companies we were looking at was this Japanese IoT company. So we started looking at the IoT company. That was my other chance to sort of get back into IoT. I said, oh, let's look at it again, and found that the field hasn't really progressed as much as I thought it would. So we started looking into blockchain, and then coincidentally, another Stanford classmate of mine, his name is Jianbo Wang. So he is, at the time, I think he was head of trading for ETFs for Deutsche Bank. So he very abruptly quit his job and said, I'm joining this blockchain startup. So I'm like, what? Wow.
Where was he at the time? Was he in China, or where was he?
He was in Hong Kong.
Okay.
He was in Hong Kong. And then so I asked him more about what's going on. So apparently his high school classmates, whom I happen to actually now, in retrospect, I actually play poker with them. And so his high school classmates actually were operating the largest ICO platform in China, called ICO-H. So at the time, they took up about a third of China's overall ICO fundraising activities. And China was taking up, I think, over a third of global ICO fundraising, right? So they were huge. And so he was going to join them. And then they were going to, in the process of creating a decentralized exchange, right? So it was all very exciting. And then the government shut everything down. So then they become very worried. What are we going to do? And then Chris and I started thinking about our resources in Japan. And Japan at the time, this is at the time it was September, right, of 2017. And until now, actually, crypto exchanges are still legal in Japan. So we actually introduced them to partners who had or in the process of applying for crypto exchange licenses, so they can create partnerships and create legal entities, right? So I think having the government crack down in China really, I think chased a lot of resources and technology out of China. So it's very, very unfortunate that I think China, this is actually one area where China actually has sort of a leg up on the rest of the world because there's so much activity there. And I think was very well poised to actually take advantage of this new technology, right? But in the end, most people sort of got out. And it was through all these sort of series of events, right? That sort of happened starting from 2013 all the way till, through 2017. I think that China, being in China was very interesting because blockchain was something that was happening. It was really a hotbed of activity, right, with blockchain in China. So had I been somewhere else, maybe not as much, because as far as I understand it, well, blockchain has always, right now, even as it stands today, is sort of a fringe kind of a technology, right? So respectable people don't talk about blockchain, right? That's for the scammers. So I think in China, it has this sort of it was very, very big. It was very, very big in China. So had I lived somewhere else, maybe I would not have been exposed to so much of this stuff. And because of my personal connections and my sort of social circles, that I was able to actually hear about a lot of these things, I think probably earlier than other people would have. So that's, I think living in China does have something to do with it.
So what kind of ongoing technology development is required for Taraxa? What kind of R&D work are you going to have to do from this point?
Yeah, so we are actually, so we need to create a protocol. We're referencing our protocol on top of another project called Nano. So Nano, I think, was released towards the end of last year and introduces very innovative block lattice topology, which I think is very, very interesting. It's also specifically interesting for light nodes because it has a naturally sharded, ledger, right, per account and, in our case, also per smart contract. But anyway, so I think for us, we need to borrow that concept and actually build a smart contract on a system on top of it, right? So that's sort of the R&D work that we need to do. It's actually quite a bit of work. I mean,
what about the talent? Where is the talent really distributed all over the world?
Yeah, the talent is so the talent is interesting in that you can't go out and just hire a blockchain expert, right? So if someone tells you they're a blockchain expert, they're either a billionaire or they're trying to scam you. That's sort of how this works, right? So so what you're really looking at, or what I'm really looking at, right? So I think I first kicked off this project towards the end of last year, and very quickly I started realizing is that it was very, very difficult to convince a lot of my classmates and friends who are not really interested in blockchain or had heard a lot about it to sort of cross over, right, into the dark side of blockchain. So what ended up happening was that the most effective way to recruit people is actually to talk with people on open source communities, right? So you're on Reddit, you're on Discord, you're on Slack, you're talking to various people in projects, and you're very discreetly talking to them secret, like, you're interested in participating in my project. So, and then you make some posts, you talk to a lot of people, you build up your personal reputation. People think you're kind of a legit guy and be kind of cool to work with. So, so that's one way. Another way is actually through academia, right? So one of the interesting things I found is that one of our primary advisor is Professor Morris Herlihy, who is a professor at Brown University and a world authority in distributed computing and concurrency. So I found him because I started reading a lot of academic papers, right? Because I had a set of very specific problems I needed to solve. And since no one else in blockchain was doing anything related to it, so I had to go back and read academic papers. And I found a lot of research, that Professor Herlihy did that was relevant to what I wanted to do. And it just so happened that he's also very interested in blockchain as well. So I just, cold emailed him and got him on board. So I think through that connection, I was able to actually get a lot of people from academic backgrounds to actually collaborate with me on this project. So it's also very interesting because I think when academics, when they work with businesses or commercial entities, right, it's always sort of what's under IP, locked under IP, what's proprietary, can I publish on this or that? Usually there are a lot of rules on what you can and cannot publish. So when I first met Professor Herlihy, I was talking to him. So he asked me the same question, right? So can we publish? And I said, yeah, it's all open source. Like there's no IP. You can publish anything. And he was like, wow, that's refreshing, right? That seems kind of nice, right? So I said, yeah, the more papers you publish, the better, right? In fact, later on, I'm willing to fund academic research, right? Because that advances sort of the state of the technology. So, yeah, I mean, academia and then just talking to people online, finding people. That's sort of it's sort of haphazard way.
So the community is really not geographically restricted.
Yeah. So I think this is probably one of the, well, in recent memory, I guess, one of the few sort of software innovations that has not really sprung up in Silicon Valley. I think that's a fair statement, right? So I think that's a fair statement. A lot of teams, after they build up their technologies, have come to Silicon Valley because this is the place to come, right? Obviously, but I don't think a lot of technologies actually grew out of Silicon Valley, so. Okay. So it's very global.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around this kind of anti-startup description you've given of Taraxa. So how do you reward people for the effort that they put into building the contracts and this kind of stuff? You pay them, right?
You mean building the system?
Well, or building the system. You keep calling it a project. Building the company?
Yeah.
What can I say?
Yeah, building the protocol, right? So,
okay.
So first of all, they get paid since, living, obviously, if you're going to live, especially in the Bay Area, it's not cheap.
Yeah, right.
So second of all, they get a token allocations, which you can think of as sort of like shares.
Kind of like stock options.
Kind of like stock options, right? So, so that's how they
Okay, but that means that the company has to grow in a certain way in value.
Yes.
So that then their token allocations will be worth more later than they are now.
But what's growing in value is not the company. What's growing in value is the ecosystem. Right?
Okay.
Yeah. So the more people participate in the ecosystem, the more valuable your token becomes.
Okay.
Right. So you can. There's a website called coinmarketcap.com. That sort of tells you about the market capitalization of all these different projects. So that's how you can ascertain how valuable something is.
How long do you think the life of this is before you just say, okay, victory, go home, troops? Do you think 5-10 years, and then basically everybody find your next project?
That's very hard to tell how long it would take because we're a protocol project, right? I think it's my view on blockchain protocols is that right now there are a lot of different protocols, but protocols as they are to behave, right, as we see from history, is that they will inevitably converge, right? So right now there might be like 10, 20, 30 different protocols, but later on there should probably be 1 or 2 or 3, right? So they will all converge. And the fact that they're all open source makes it easy for them to converge, because then they will start borrowing features and functionalities from each other, and then they would just converge, right? So this
is the kind of thing that I'm sort of surprised that nobody like IBM is trying to push one that they are developing in-house.
Well, I think they have Hyperledger, which they're pushing.
Right.
So
a big company with billions of dollars of marketing budget and, a worldwide organization, why aren't they running you out?
Why aren't they running me out?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
They haven't found you yet. This may be a dangerous presentation.
Yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of these larger corporations, they create solutions for private chains, right? And
I see.
So they're really not out there to create public chains because, like I said, a lot of the public chain applications really threaten the existing business models of corporations, right? Because it tends to break them down and start to remove their sort of some of their competitive advantages. So large companies really like private chains, right? In fact, I think there's a large set of capital out there that specifically only fund private chain projects because it makes very simple economic sense. It's that I do a project for you, you pay me, right? And that's the end of that.
For sure, in the automobile world, you can almost guarantee that you've got the Toyota ecosystem and then the Ford ecosystem, and
probably
the two of them would not allow any kind of communication between them.
That's really what's sort of wrong. So in IoT, right, one of the other biggest problems is that every single manufacturer wants to create their own standard, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm on my own standard. My standard is going to kill the world and blah, 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 right? So of course, then no one else thinks like you. Obviously, they think their standard is going to take over the world. And so then you have all these silos of different standards, and they try very hard to make them incompatible with one another, because that's how you defend your market share, right? So that does not create more value. That creates less value over time. But in the short term, if you're looking at quarterly earnings, you're not going to. That's not how corporations are incented. So
yeah. Okay, let's open the floor to questions. Go ahead, Scott.
Thanks. This is really fascinating. Is the Taraxa blockchain as a public protocol something that even a currency, say, out of the Chinese government could help provide the blockchain ledger structure for? And is it done primarily in Mandarin? Is Taraxa a Mandarin-speaking country? I'm interested in the language comparison as the blockchain ledger.
So this is very interesting. To answer your question, actually, maybe if you asked me this last week, I wouldn't have been able to give you an answer. But so we didn't do any marketing, right? So we don't really know who knows about us and who doesn't know about us. And last Tuesday, I remember these things because they it's very, very, very interesting. I updated my website because, for the longest time I had this single page website that doesn't say anything, right? It's like coming soon, stay tuned, right? So I thought, it was time to start telling people about the project, and I need to start recruiting more, and I can't have potential candidates looking at the website, wow, scam company, right? So I said I'll update my website, and I created a new website, and I told a few people on Discord about it. Hey, new website, check it out. And then I created a Telegram group and all these other things. And then my Telegram group went from 0 to 5,000 people in 4 days. And then I had thousands of emails asking me how they can make investments and begging me for allocations. And to this day, I'm not really sure where these people come from. But just judging from sort of talking to a random sample of them, because I really don't know how to choose from these people. And there are a lot of people who are interested from India. There's people from Brazil who are interested in this. There are obviously a lot of Americans. I think there's a group of people in Turkey who apparently are interested in this as well. Very few people in China, because all my communication have been written in English. Although there have been attack articles written about me in Chinese, which is very interesting. Not really sure why. But I think maybe the attention I'm getting is sort of mirrors the distribution of the nano community, right? Because I told a lot of people about sort of how I'm building on top of nano, and I think there's a lot of excitement from the nano community that there's sort of a smart contract project that's built on top of block lattice. So nano is not a well-known project in China. Very, very, very few people have heard of it. So I guess it's only natural that the people who are sort of paying attention to my project don't currently come from China. Now, obviously, I intend to change that, but exactly how I'm going to do that is still in question. So right now, I would think that it's probably everywhere except China. I'm not really sure. Yeah.
What about adoption? Where do you think
adoption?
Is that geographic? Does that argue for staying in China?
So being very tactical, right? So I think that because if you're working with IoT devices, naturally you want to go to places in the world that are sort of major manufacturing centers of IoT devices, right? So then you start looking at places like China and Japan. I think those are very natural places to develop this technology because you want to be working with, so the sort of the eventual goal, it would be great if we can actually start integrating a lot of the protocol into devices directly.
When they're manufactured.
When they're manufactured. Mm-hmm. But of course, this is something that only works if you have compelling applications and business models on the back end, or else the device makers now, well, why am I doing this, right? Why am I adding additional cost to this? So, but in any case, I think it's very interesting to look at these markets. And China, I think, particularly is going to be a pretty interesting market. Now, this once again, this is being recorded, right? So, it's technically, I guess, I'm not really sure. This is an honest answer. I'm not really sure how illegal it is because the government says it's illegal in China, right? The Chinese government says that ICOs are illegal.
Yeah.
That's definitely illegal because I understand that because like 99% of ICOs are scams. People just take the money and run, right? So, okay, that makes sense. Cryptocurrencies are also illegal. Okay, so that's sort of connected to ICO. But we love blockchain. So not really sure where that sort of cognitive dissonance is happening.
So it really depends on whether your token is an asset for investment or whether it's a functional item for doing something.
As far as I know, those sort of fine-grained distinctions are not being made. So I mean, I think I spent a couple months in the U.S. I think I left Shanghai in January and stayed in the U.S. for 2 months, talking to a lot of people and trying to recruit a team. And my perception has always been, well, it's illegal in China. So if cryptocurrency is banned, then obviously blockchain is banned. So you can't have any applications in blockchain in China. So China is a dead market, no way, right? And then I started talking to my extended team and advisors. They're like, no, there are tons of companies doing blockchain projects. And I'm like, isn't that illegal? And they're like, look, it's China, right? So you don't know, right? There are governments. I think the government in Shenzhen is like sponsoring blockchain projects. The government in Hangzhou is sponsoring. So is it illegal? I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, the Central Bank of China is researching their own cryptocurrency. So how illegal is it? So I think,
have federal coins ever been considered, or bills ever been considered an Internet of Thing, a thing that could be blockchain supported in any federal government? I mean, could bills and coins that were administered by a central bank be considered
like fiat currency?
An IoT?
Like paper money?
Paper money or
well, I think you would just replace it, right? You would just replace it with a cryptocurrency. I think it's very likely that, and I might not know what I'm talking about. It's very likely that the Chinese government will release a cryptocurrency that replaces the RMB, and that would be revolutionary. I think, in terms of the amount of I wouldn't say control, but I guess the amount of oversight they can exert on the economy, because then you have, there's no tax evasion, there's no money laundering, there's really no anything, right? Because everyone is perfectly visible. So that would be a very interesting, I think, outcome, right? To sort of watch for. Yeah, you wouldn't really need paper money at that point, I think. So.
Walter.
Very fascinating talk. Now, the way I understand you make money is you build an ecosystem, and then you give out the token to whoever work for you or provide service. When the ecosystem is big enough, if someone want to use a ecosystem, they have to get hold of your token.
Yes.
for service exchange.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, at the end, if you want the token to be valuable, you still have to exchange it into US dollar or whatever, right? So that's how it works.
Yeah. So. I mean, the world still runs on USD.
Because that probably was not covered by the tape. People who are not part of the, who haven't signed the broadcast release form, your questions will not be heard. So to repeat what you're talking about, the idea is that as you build the ecosystem, then the tokens that really constitute the ecosystem become how you really, they become items of value. And so the question is,
If you want to use token to
you
leave,
still have to convert it. You still have to convert
regular
the
money.
token to something.
That depends on when Pizza Hut will start taking bitcoins, right? I mean, when they took Bitcoin at one point, I think someone spent 1,000 Bitcoin to buy a pizza or something. Yeah, but that guy's regretting it.
I do remember seeing vending machines in Japan that were accepting Bitcoin.
Yeah, Bitflyer, right? So.
Yeah.
Once again, this is just a matter of adoption, right? I mean, as in all things, I think cryptocurrency has an adoption curve. Right now, it's sort of at the beginning of the curve. It's very difficult to use. I'm always afraid I'll lose all my money at some point because I send it to the wrong address or something, or lose my key, and whatever variety of reasons. So it's very scary for sort of the average user, or it's scary for everybody, not just the average user, right? So. There is some ways to go in terms of adoption, but at some point, if everyone's using cryptocurrencies for everything, then you wouldn't need to convert into fiat currency. But what you would actually see happen is that you actually, instead of fiat currency, you would actually see ecosystem currency, right? Which is sort of what's happening today. Is that, I mean, people always say that corporations have become a lot more influential than nation states. So this is probably an interesting extension in that. You don't necessarily have corporations, but you have global economic ecosystems whose currencies become very influential, right? In the way that they're applied. So.
Okay, go ahead.
Do those hackathons that you went to still happen in Shanghai? And what did you do other than the hackathons to learn more about blockchain?
The hackathons and the meetings and the meetups, they still happen on a frequent basis in China. So once again, that's a sign that it's not entirely illegal. What did I do to learn about blockchain? I just read. I just went online and I just kept reading all sorts of white papers and all sorts of academic papers, and just kept reading and reading. That's how you learn about blockchain, I guess.
In China or anything like that, or just online stuff?
Are there classes on blockchain? I guess
think
there probably are.
Cyprus, like Nicosia University and stuff like that.
Okay.
There is. I'm just wondering what you
Yeah.
did.
I mean, there should be classes on blockchain, I think so.
Okay, next question.
Yeah.
On the big ag example that you gave, really intrigued by that. You talked about drones collecting data over fields. So I'm wondering, is your business model in that case really going to be B2B? And what's the involvement of the actual farmer? Is the farmer know that somebody is kind of saddle backing on the drone and taking photos and looking at pest control and then sending back data? Does the farmer get that for free? Is like organ donation in effect?
Yeah,
Organ donor isn't compensated, but everybody else is in the ecosystem?
So the question has to do with the smart drones or smart devices that may be able to buy and sell their data on their own.
Yeah, and
Right.
then if the device owns the data, how does a lawyer sue the device? Lawyers don't like that, right?
Yeah, so that's actually a very interesting question because the farmers typically don't own the drones. So the drones are usually owned by the operators and the distributors that actually operate them. So you might say that it might be unfair for the, for example, the drone operator to own that data. But then again, they're the ones who made the investments, right, to actually collect that data. So I think it could be fair or unfair.
Proceeds, I could see a rights licensing agreement where the farmer would get a royalty percentage.
Maybe. I mean,
Depends on who takes the risk.
as in all things, right? If something's not really that profitable, nobody really cares what you're doing. If something becomes very profitable, I'm sure the farmers will start caring, and then people will work something out, and it's a market. I think things will just work it out by themselves. Yeah, that's sort of how we see it. I'm sorry, I forgot your second question.
Okay, a lawyer.
Oh, lawyer.
Impact on-
Yeah, so this is actually a very interesting question because so if you think about selling data, right? Data selling is very questionable because, well, it's not questionable. It's hard, right? So you on the buyer side, you're always wondering, is the data I'm getting real? Is that real data, right? And the seller is always thinking, well, is this guy going to buy my data and start pirating it, right? So there are no sort of absolute technological solutions to both these problems. I mean, there's never really been any technological solution for these problems. Now, on the data authenticity side, what you could do is that you could have a set of devices that are made, say, for example, made by the manufacturer, right? So if I'm Toyota, what I can do is that every year I can publish a list and say, I don't know how many cars they make. Say that they made 1 million cars this year, and say I made 1 million cars, and these are the public keys and serial numbers of these 1 million cars. And any data that come from or signed by these keys came from my cars, right? Any data that did not come from these keys did not come from my car, right? So, so that's a way for you to know where the data is coming from, right? Another way for you to know where data coming from, other people will say, well, you can create an algorithm that analyzes data, see if it's real. Well, look, if you can create an algorithm to figure out data is real, someone can fake it so that your algorithm can tell it's real, right? So that's not really a viable way to do it. Now, even with devices that have validated sort of signatures, it's still not foolproof. Someone can still fake it. They can rip out the signature chip and put it on a laptop and generate fake data. They can do that, right? It's always doable. So that's something that requires legal recourse, right? On the piracy side, there's just no way technology can solve any of that problem. Once I've sold you the data, you have the data, period. I can't force you to forget about the data, right? There's no enforced forgetfulness in cryptography. So if you start selling that data, then there's not much I can do about it. So from a technological perspective. So for a good data market to really exist, there needs to be an off-chain legal recourse. So this actually creates a very interesting question is that will, in the future, on-chain smart contracts have corresponding off-chain legal contracts? Right? That would be a very interesting problem to sort of look at. Because that's really the only way that you can enforce these type of things. Now, right now, the way to sort of not circumvent, but to cushion this problem is that I would think that the operator of the data market in the beginning, they are some commercial entity. Right? For example, Carblock is probably some commercial entity. These are commercial entities. And they will provide a legal guarantee that if something goes wrong, they are sort of arbitrators of people who, weren't happy with their purchases, right? So, but that only really works in the short term when the parties who are participating on the platform are small and known, right? If it really becomes successful, reaches wide adoption, then parties become completely unknown. So then that becomes very, very difficult to enforce. So then you go into the question, well, okay, so now you cannot have anonymity on the blockchain anymore. So every single person who actually transacts via smart contract on data need to provide their real legal entities, and somehow store that in a different chain or whatever, right? And only gets triggered when there's a dispute. So one of the people I talked to said that you're creating this entire new legal system that mirrors the off-chain legal system on-chain, right? So not really sure if that's the right solution, but I think that going forward, this problem will become more and more poignant as these type of ecosystems gain wider and wider adoption. It's something that we don't necessarily have to think about right now, but it's coming. Yeah, it's coming.
It will be a problem that has to be solved at some point.
At some point.
Yeah. So what kind of team do you need to develop in order to build this project out? Is it mostly technology developers? Are you going to have people on the biz dev side or what?
Yeah, definitely. So I think so early on, I think it's sort of the entire space is driven mostly by just technologists, right? They're mostly driven by hackers who had an interest in technology, did it in their spare time, sort of published it, and somehow became very big, and they decided, hey, this could be my livelihood, and you start doing it.
Yeah.
That's going to become rarer and rarer going forward. And not only that's going to become rarer and rarer, the idea of if you build it, they will come sort of mentality is not really going to work, because you're going to have very sort of directed, focused business development, especially for IoT, because IoT is just not. IoT is very, very hard. It's very hard to build sort of successful business models with IoT data. So you do need very focused business development teams. So that's absolutely necessary. So typically what's very interesting is that in typical blockchain teams, there's sort of the tech team, and there's a huge marketing team, right, who actually are in charge of community engagement and sort of market value management. They're there to make sure that to continuously generate interest and hype about their project so their market cap doesn't go down. A lot of it seems, if you look at it from a traditional securities perspective, seems like market manipulation. It is on a large extent. That's why the government probably don't like it, right? So
I do see pictures of people selling snake oil.
Yeah, definitely. So you have tech team, you have the tech team, you have the marketing team, and sort of the community engagement team, and then increasingly, at least for Taraxa, there will definitely be a significant business development team. We're going to be recruiting, once we scale up, we're going to be recruiting people from specific industry verticals, right? Automotive, agriculture, whatever. People who have domain-specific knowledge about a specific vertical and have the relationships and are able to speak and articulate the vision well to potential ecosystem partners that we're going to be working with. So.
Okay, so I'll ask one more question. We'll end up. We've got some refreshments outside. Want to make sure that we have a chance to talk informally.
Sure.
Last question is, okay, look into the crystal ball. In a couple of years, are we going to start to see this start to take off, or what do you think we're going to see? What should we watch for? What do you think will be a major significant event that shows that blockchain is finally starting to move into IoT systems?
IoT systems. Well, if we do our jobs right, blockchain will not really be talked about, right? I mean, I think I really keep talking about is that if the entire blockchain space does its job right, blockchain will not be talked about. Just like we don't talk about TCP/IP today. You should not be talking about blockchain. If you're talking about blockchain, that means the state of the art today is insufficient to meet commercial applications. So one sign of success for any blockchain project is that in the future nobody talks about blockchain anymore. It would just become this invisible layer.
The natural way things are done.
Natural way things are done. Now, so it's hard for me to see what kind of signal that you would have about IoT, but I don't know. I think maybe people start to have much more. I guess people start to experience the world in a much richer. People have a much richer experience of the world.
And it may indeed be. You start to see buying and selling of data in ways that hasn't happened before, right?
Well, that's not normal. People don't usually see that, I guess. But normal people, I think, well, not. I'm sorry if this sounds derogative, but just like everybody, right? So everyone would actually maybe start to see a richer world. Because the whole point of IoT devices is that they provide data insights that enable some sort of automation and some sort of intelligence, right? And there are a lot of things that today that are pretty manual or could be much better or could be a lot smarter that are not. So yeah, I mean, life would just become easier, and people would perceive the world being a lot richer, I guess, degree. Yeah. So I mean, I can't tell you like a specific event that's going to happen if we do our jobs right. Because if we do our jobs right, nobody will know that you did anything at all, I guess. So.
Okay, that sounds good. Let's all enjoy talking more informally outside. In the meantime, please join me for thanking Stephen for a very interesting, stimulating presentation.